Okay, so I think we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this special panel discussion, which we present in support of PTSD Awareness Month. My name is Dr. Katie Andrews. I'm a research associate at the Canadian Institute for Public Safety and Treatment, or CIPSART, and I will be your moderator today. And we're going to discuss shifting barriers, destigmatizing post-traumatic stress injuries among first responders and other public safety personnel. This is the knowledge exchange hub for the National Research Consortium on Post-Traumatic Stress Injuries among public safety personnel. CIPSART is contributing to the national conversation on PTSD awareness by helping to share resources and to connect PSP and their family with evidence-based mental health information and treatments provided by academics, researchers, and clinicians across Canada. This panel discussion is one such contribution. Another is our online Shifting Barriers PTSD resource page, which we hope you will visit and share. We have placed a link in the chat for you to view that page, and a video recording of this panel discussion will be located there as well after the session. So before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the land on which this webinar is being hosted. CIPSART is housed at the University of Regina, located on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territories, the ancestral lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota nations, and the homeland of the Métis. It is with a gratitude that we offer this land acknowledgement as a small part of the ongoing conversation towards reconciliation. Okay, so just some quick housekeeping before we get started. All attendees are or should be in listen-only mode, and your cameras are also off by default. We had a couple people join with a panelist link, so if you are a panelist link and you're not supposed to be, the correct link is in the chat. That will put you into attendee mode. Today's session is also being recorded and will be made available online later on that link for the resource page. And we have set time aside for your questions, so please send us your questions at any time through the Zoom question box, and we will answer as many as possible when we get to that segment of the discussion. This event will also be presented in English with the option of simultaneous captions or audio translation in French. So there's a link in the chat which will enable you to log into Wordly. This is our simultaneous translation platform. Be sure to select French in the top right corner and keep this window open throughout the session. Okay, so now I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists. First, we have Michael Ainger, who is the manager of the Employee Mental Health Unit with Correctional Service Canada. We also have Dr. Rose Riccardelli, who is the research chair in safety, security, and wellness with the Fisheries and Marine Institute of Memorial University of Newfoundland, or Newfoundland, whichever you prefer. I was trying to nail that one. I've obviously been out of Canada too long and have defaulted to Newfoundland. We also have Robin Shields, who is a doctoral candidate in clinical psychology at the University of Regina, as well as a research assistant at CIPSART and the Anxiety and Illness Behavior Lab. So welcome to our panelists, and thank you for joining today. I'm going to get us started with just a little bit of background information on the topic. As we know, public safety personnel, or PSP, as we'll likely refer to them today, are frequently exposed to potentially psychologically traumatic events and other occupational stressors, collectively increasing their risk for developing post-traumatic stress injuries, or PTSI. So the term PTSI is used as part of the federal framework on PTSD recognition and support by the Public Health Agency of Canada, and this was done to broadly describe and destigmatize several mental disorder diagnoses that might follow potentially psychologically traumatic event exposures. So this includes post-traumatic stress disorder and other disorders such as generalized anxiety, major depressive disorder, or social anxiety, but is not limited to those few. So stigma is a well-documented barrier to seeking support for mental health among PSP. Stigma has been reported to deter PSP from seeking help, from discussing distressing issues with other members, out of fear of being deemed unfit for duty. So stigma can be oriented toward seeking support and experiencing mental health struggles, whether that is personally or towards others. So with our discussion today, we hope to provide a better understanding of how stigma might impact PSP and how research on stigma can help to inform strategies and training that can help PSP mitigate and manage mental health challenges. So I would like to now invite each panelist to say a few words about their own experience on the topic of stigma and post-traumatic stress injuries. So let's start with Michael, if you want to kick us off.
Perfect. Thanks, Katie. Put me on the spot. First one out of the gate. I promise I won't set the bar too high for my co-panelists. So first and foremost, I'd like to start by saying thank you to SIPSRP for putting this together. It's timely, it's an important topic, and one that humbly I'm very honored to be a participant in and working with Rose and Robin in this capacity. So I guess just really quickly, as a brief introduction for myself, as suggested, I work with Correctional Services Canada. I started my career here about 16 years ago as a correctional officer and spent most of that time in an institution in a correctional officer role. Had the opportunity to work with our emergency response teams as a crisis negotiator. Moving on from those roles, both formally and volunteer, into working at a point in our academies, training new recruits, and then most recently with this great opportunity to work in employee mental health under a human resource branch. And why I present this information to you is not to go over my resume, which I don't think anybody necessarily needs to hear, but rather to suggest that in all those capacities, in everywhere I've had the opportunity to travel within the field of public safety, I suppose, there has been a common theme of mental health, of wellness, and to today's subject, PTSIs naturally follow with that. And as I say, I think it's good that we're having these conversations around reducing stigma, of encouraging people to speak up if they're struggling, and if they're healthy, to seek opportunities to help others. We do, wherever you find yourself in this field of public safety, we do hard work that I think we're all proud of, as am I. But again, it doesn't matter if you find yourself at the very top of your respective organizations or just starting your careers. Everybody has opinions, everybody has perspectives on mental health, and I really think there's no better time to be working in this area than right now. So again, thank you very much for including me, and I look forward to a good conversation this morning or this afternoon if you're in the East.
Thanks, Michael. Rose, would you like to go next?
Sure. I'll probably be a bit more academic. I'm Rose. So I work across different public safety sectors. And one of the things when we think about stigma, I think that's really important to recognize, is stigma is not just a thing tied to a thing. It's an entire theory. It's a way we frame understandings of different elements of the world. And it's that implicit bias that's kind of like in the back of your head and makes you engage in different ways that you wouldn't, and say things and do things you wouldn't normally say, but something's happening that's driving it, right? That stigma is those things that exist beyond our best intentions. So it takes an active effort to recognize when it's happening and to call it out. And when I was thinking a little bit about the topic today, in terms of the barriers, I looked at it more with PTSI and all those barriers that exist to treatment seeking and intervention seeking. And one of the things that came to mind in that respect is I was thinking about why many public safety personnel would stop before going forward. So I looked at a lot of work that's been done in the area and my own work, and had a couple conversations and tried to think of what was underpinning what we were finding, because we're all finding the same thing, but it's not making the impact we want. So in that, what became very clear is in public safety, you're as good as your last day. And I think that's really, really important, because that last action, that last event kind of helps determine how things are moving forward. And that doesn't mean that's right. But I think that's one of the reasons that people are uncomfortable, and one of those barriers to care. And I also think what we don't talk about is that sense of duty to not leave people short-staffed, and that obligation to your colleagues that is so important, that drives people to work through times where maybe they should take. And then also what we do, instead of putting people on immediate leave, because people don't want to leave work, and sometimes they might have to, is why don't we reduce the hours and do different things? So instead of talking about all those barriers that we talked about at length, I was just thinking of different ways to incorporate them. And all these things are informed by stigma, because if we could understand what mental health looks like for everyone, we wouldn't have such a negative perception towards it. So that's what I thought I would say to introduce myself. Otherwise, I do work across public safety organizations. I spend most of my time working in corrections, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for having us.
Thanks so much, Rose. That's great insight. Robin, would you like to go next?
Sure. I think I have to, since I'm last. Like Katie said, I am a doctoral student in clinical psychology. But before I did that, I was actually a paramedic in Alberta for 10 years. And I sustained a PTSI while working, and experienced stigma myself. I had an older paramedic say to me, well, if you can't handle the calls, then maybe this isn't the right job for you. Which at the time I thought, oh my God, what have I done? I went to school to be a paramedic and now I can't handle it. But after seeking treatment and feeling a lot better, I realized that, that was kind of one of those just, I think we call it old boy club, old man club way of looking at things, and that it is entirely okay to sustain a PTSI. We do hard work. We are humans, and those are natural reactions to some of the stuff that we have to go through. And so that kind of experience with stigma is really what, I worked for 6 or 8 years after that experience, but that's really kind of what led me to being here today, to picking my entire life up and moving to Regina to go to school. Because I realized that a lot of my colleagues at the time just didn't have a great understanding about mental health. And that was a while ago now. That was kind of in the like 2010-ish range. And so I think, over the last 10 or 14 years, there's been so much great work at reducing stigma for public safety, but I think we still have a long way to go. And doing things like this panel and talking about it is such a great way to confront the issue, I think, and just say, hey, I think there was a group out of Ontario that used to say heroes are humans too. And so I like to talk about this kind of stuff, and yeah.
Thanks so much, Robin. I know that we're very lucky at CIPSR to have you and the research team and have your perspectives from your experience. So we appreciate you joining us today. So thank you to all the panelists for their insights. It's wonderful to hear all the different perspectives. So next, we're going to move on to a bit of question and answer segment. I'm going to start by posing a few questions to the panels, and then I would like to remind the audience to feel free to post your questions in the Zoom question box, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible throughout the rest of the hour. So let's just kick this off with first question. I'm going to pose this to Rose. I know you're trying to take a different approach, but just to kind of give some background of what the scope of the problem with PTSI among PSP, and then how prevalent it is and what is the impact of this, just to give the audience a bit of background.
So if I speak to corrections, I'll speak to the the survey we did earlier over the last few years, which looked at every provincial and territorial correctional services, we know that prevalence of mental health disorders is at 60%. As a response to that reality, it's about 59 to 63, and that is across the organizations in every province and territory. PTSIs and the prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder equates to about 30%. So, and the one thing we have to remember that when we look at PTSI and we look at post-traumatic stress, as much as the event is an impact, so is the environment around that. So the colleagues, how your colleagues support you, how management supports you, how all these things are happening will also have an impact on the PTSI. So I think these things all go hand in hand. The prevalence is high and it is a problem. And that's why we had in 2016, we had the post-traumatic stress injuries bill that was passed in Parliament and tabled by the Conservative Party. We've had a lot of movement and understanding in that space. And it shows that this is a challenge that needs to be recognized, among other challenges.
Thank you so much. Just building off of that, so Robin, stigma is not a clinical diagnosis, but it can impact the way or can interact with PTSI and impact treatment and recovery from a PTSI. But in what ways can this interaction occur?
Yeah, so stigma has a really big impact on mental health and PTSIs. People often avoid or delay seeking treatment or help because of concerns that they might be treated differently, fears of losing their job. Like Rose mentioned earlier, the thought that their colleagues will look at them differently or that they're weak. Right. And so people often put off seeking treatment or talking about their mental health because of that stigma. There's a couple of different types of stigma. So we have public stigma, which is how others relate to you. So, for example, in that paramedic saying to me, well, maybe this isn't the right job for you. That would be an example of public stigma. But we also have self-stigma. And this is really the negative attitudes and kind of internalized shame that people have about mental health or mental illness towards themselves. And so there's actually a large body of research that suggests that self-stigma leads to reduced hope, to lower self-esteem, to increased mental health symptoms, and really reduces the likelihood of continuing in treatment. And so, like, overall, stigma really contributes to poorer treatment outcomes. So essentially, if you're kind of sitting there beating yourself up for having a mental health condition, you're less likely to seek treatment, less likely to stay in treatment if you do seek treatment, and less likely to get better. So there's a really big impact that stigma has on PTSIs.
Thanks so much, Robin. That's great insight. I think we'll switch now over to a little bit more of a occupational sector perspective. So a lot of times, like Rose says, stigma occurs, but maybe people are not aware of that they are partaking in stigmatizing behaviors. So I'm wondering, Michael, can you kind of touch on what are the common ways stigma can manifest among PSP and like what this looks like in your experience working in the correctional area?
Sure. So I'll posit this answer by saying, unlike my colleagues, I won't give necessarily so much an academic answer, but just what I've experienced in my travels. So don't hold me to this, Rose. I'm sorry, I can't prove this answer, but it's certainly what I've seen perhaps along the way. So in terms of the way that I've observed stigma manifesting itself within my area of PSP corrections is actually with an occurrence that Rose defines in her research around the creation of trauma hierarchies in a sense. So if we look at stigma and how it contributes to trauma hierarchies and perhaps how trauma hierarchies contribute to stigma, what I'm talking about is that in essence, certain experiences may be interpreted as more traumatic based on the event and the PSP role for those involved in the event. And Rose, this sounds familiar because I'm borrowing from your text. But for example, those involved in an emergency event, a police shooting, for example, may be interpreted as more traumatic than those arriving on scene later. From a corrections perspective, the correctional officers that have to respond to the major disturbance versus those that have to do the debriefing after, that have to unpack the incident. And based on your role in responding to those events, you're either seen as, my experience is naturally traumatizing, and whatever experience, whatever affects me moving beyond that is justified, versus well, you weren't there, you didn't see it happen, you just read it after the fact, so you really don't have a position to feel affected as much as I do, right? Some people's trauma are more important than others, is I think what some, historically we've seen in our organizations, which leads to some people's mental health experiences, some people's PTSI diagnosis, if we get to that, being validated by our peer groups, versus other people's being rejected as ungenuine or taking advantage of the situation, which in my experience, my travels, often this is based on sort of the social statuses we find ourselves within these groups. If you're an ERT member, for example, in our organization, and you suffer PTSI, I would posit that you're probably less likely to be questioned, given your social status as highly regarded in the organization and doing what people see as like the hard work within corrections, versus others maybe more administrative roles, or people that are newer into the organization that really don't have a reason to complain, if you will. And from that, we start to see behaviors that go with that stigma of, exclusion. If people don't see your circumstances as valid, shaming. It's like, well, why are you needing time off? You didn't respond to the incident, you just read about it after, or even up to the point of bullying and outright harassment, which in terms of impacts on the individual, what we can see stemming from then those behaviors: increased psychological complaints, depression, burnout, anxiety, all of these residual impacts of that stigma. So I present this to you because the stigma itself, obviously, as we hear from Robin and Rose, present barriers to seeking help. But also, if this persists, it can compound itself and further negatively impacting the individual. And lastly, what I'll say for organizations where this stigma is allowed to persist is that if it goes unchecked, what we begin to see is the siloing of occupational groups, where rather than Correctional Services of Canada being a cohesive team comprised of people that are doing their respective jobs in advancement of our mission, we start to see people working in individual teams that can't interrelate because of that hierarchy that gets built in. And to the end of that, what I will say is that if we don't check the stigmas that go with mental health, if we don't work to break down the trauma hierarchies that Rose outlines in her research, if that doesn't matter to you, if that part doesn't matter, why it should is because, as I have seen, at the end of the line, this can lead to outright safety issues, where if you don't feel like you have a place to speak about how you're being affected by your work and how it's affecting your well-being, then do you have the ability to speak about unsafe work conditions? Do you have then a hesitancy to put your hand up and ask for help in other areas of your job, which then, particularly in our environment, can lead to people being isolated and more susceptible to coercion, manipulation by our offender populations, which leads to pretty broad and systemic safety issues for all of us. So to me, it's not just about stigma, it's about overall safety of individuals, teams, and our organization, that there's latent effects that go with this, that there is value in breaking down these stigmas for PTSIs and for health and wellness, but then more broadly in creating inclusive organizations where people feel they can speak up about any matter regardless of their rank or role.
That's a great point. Stigma is not, it's just the tip of the iceberg for the issues related to health and safety of our PSP. And if you aren't willing to start there, then you have a whole other list of issues that can come from that. So that's a really great point. Rose, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
I wouldn't add anything. I think Mike has it.
Great, thank you. And Robin, did you have anything from your perspective as a paramedic that you wanted to add?
I mean, I'm not sure that I've ever considered that there's that sort of spillover for people not wanting to talk about other things as well. But just listening to Mike say that, I can think of times where that's happened, where I've seen it happen. So I think that's such a great point to bring forward. Thanks for that, Mike.
Okay, so we have some questions coming through from the audience. So I want to shift over to these so we make sure that we engage with everyone who's taken the time to attend the panel today. So let me just see here. The first question, and this is just open to anyone who wants to jump at it. So in my organization, sometimes I hear young people are just more sensitive and we need to hire people who are tougher. So what tips do you have to address stigma? So Robin, this is kind of along the lines of something you mentioned yourself. I don't know, do you want to start off on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this view of, let's say, millennials or the generations above that they're snowflakes is pervasive in our society, but definitely in these types of PSP occupations, because, you know, for a long time they were told, do you just do the work? You just do the work. It shouldn't bother you, right? And so my hope with these new people coming in is that they're able to start breaking that barrier. Some tips, I think, to address those stigma is just to call people's attention to it, right? To say things like, you know, when you say we should hire tougher people, you're actually saying that humans shouldn't have normal reactions to these events, and that can really limit people seeking help. I think a lot of the stigma in public safety is so ingrained that people are just not even aware that they're engaging in those kinds of behaviors. And so I think really kind of bringing it to their attention might help change their views about it.
That's a great point. Sometimes just ignoring or, you know, like I'm not doing this is not the same as preventing stigma or stopping stigma from occurring in the environment, right? So it's important to address it, but also to be proactive to mitigate it. So the next question is for Rose. That says, your comments about the structural factors around stigma was spot on. In your research, to what extent is this a cultural issue, and to what extent is it simply a question of organizational management? If short staffing is a standard management practice, then is the stigma not baked directly in the organizational structure of PSP organizations? I'm thinking specifically of the paramedic context where short staffing is just a way of doing business. So that's a long one.
So I think short staffing is our way of doing business across public safety sectors. I think we feel it in paramedics, we feel it in corrections, we feel it in police, we feel it in fire, we feel it everywhere. I have not seen an organization that doesn't feel it, including the university. I think it's really interesting bringing up this culture and organization, because those are two, like, they're one and the same. So as much as it's embedded in the organizational structure and subcultures, the organization creates the culture that prevails. So if the organization supports these more negative behaviors that generate stigma in different ways, if it's intolerant of workplace challenges, if it's intolerant of, you know, and I don't want to say harassment and bullying, those are things we know, but just negative talk, a lack of collegiality, gossip, all these things We create an environment that perpetuates things that are being negatively said, that then drives stigma. And often these things, what's underpinning them is a view of the world that stigmatizes whatever behavior is being engaged in, or whatever person based on whatever character traits. So I think culture and organizational are one and the same. And yes, they are deeply, deeply embedded. And, cultures move at different paces. What's happening in society might not be as advanced as what's happening in the institutions or in the community or in these different organizations, and vice versa. So we have to find a way of not making it a hierarchy, drawing on Mike, and instead focusing on taking the best from whatever world and trying to find ways for kindness all around.
Thank you so much, Rose. That's great. Great response. I think it's not one or the other. They're quite intertwined together. So it's something that needs to be addressed simultaneously. We have a question that is talking about some resources. So LifeWise, a lived experience organization within the last year, has launched a first responder warm line that is staffed by former first responders. This line was requested by the first responders, but call numbers are showing us that stigma is very real. So any suggestions on how to help reduce stigma and get this resource out there so people have a place to turn to? So anyone can jump on that. Go ahead, Rose.
The warm line is in Newfoundland, I believe. I think the biggest thing to get people to use a line that's run by government is trusting government. So if the public safety personnel believes that the government and their employer has their back, they'll use the line. And if they don't, because it's not independently run, the challenge, the confidentiality, those things I had talked about, that sense of duty, good as the last day, all of these challenges will prevail and be a preventative challenge. It would be a barrier. That doesn't mean it's not going to work, but getting it out there means you have to show that you're going to be there for the people. And that's really important.
Yep, it was Newfoundland. I was avoiding saying Newfoundland since I keep messing it up.
Newfoundland, understand.
Yes, I apologize to everyone from Newfoundland. Okay, so kind of building on that, because this is a question that I had myself. What have you seen as effective institutional strategies for removing barriers and encouraging treatment-seeking behaviors? So I'm going to pose this to Mike because we haven't heard from him in a while.
Thanks. So, yeah, I guess in reflecting on this question, I'll jump off from Rose's point around concepts of acknowledging historical barriers, acknowledging perhaps cultures of distrust that understandably exist, and not trying to avoid them, but that we have to overcome them if we want to be able to remove these barriers and encourage people to come forward. So I think hopefully what I'm seeing in terms of CSC moving in the right direction is an enhanced focus on one, the psychosocial factor of growth and development. Anytime we can offer people the opportunity to expand education, learning, opportunities for growth personally or professionally, in areas particularly related to mental health and wellness, the more knowledge we have, the more empowered we are to recognize when we're not doing well, and particularly when our coworkers aren't, and maybe understanding opportunities we would have to support them if we're aware of some of the resources that we just heard about. And then again, to Rose's point in previous discussions around organizational culture, for us in corrections, it has been my observation that what gets us through our days often is a focus on compliance, right? We manage large populations of, at times, difficult offenders that aren't in our custody for being naturally well-adjusted or law-abiding citizens. I don't think that's a shock to anybody. And how we organize these institutions is through compliance, which works, but where there's a bit of a pitfall that comes with that is when we apply that compliance-based control to our employee populations and our people management systems, where if we manage solely on compliance, it's effective in terms of time. We can manage people through compliance quickly, but it doesn't really yield well to long-term outcomes where people can speak up if they're struggling, where people, if they need help, can ask for it, versus a more balanced approach, which is really what we're advocating for here in CSC more so now, is to do the compliance pieces of people management as we have to, but build in compassion-based responses to that as well, recognizing that inherently people are going to make mistakes along long careers, but they still have value. They're still an important part of the team, and the decisions they make are rooted in who they are as an individual, and that in our response to managing people, that if we choose to focus on that, if we choose to apply a compassion-based lens to our people management approaches, we will encourage better performance from our staff. When it comes to their struggles, they'll be more willing to come forward. Those barriers will be reduced because, to Rose's point, if we've approached them with compassion along the way, then hopefully we're building up trust in our people, in our organizations. So to me, those are big areas that we can focus on, and really the skills that go with them aren't overly complicated. It takes an investment in time, which understandably we're all under time crunches. Work-life balance is a big thing. But really, if we can lean into the compassion piece, I think that's where we begin to see improvements in people seeking help in a preventative standpoint, getting help early on, rather than waiting till they're in that red zone of the mental health continuum, and really taking time away from work is the only reasonable response.
Yeah, I do you mind if I just add to that? I think the three of us are going to end up harping on trust, building trust with employees, and also compassion towards them. But I just wanted to give an anecdotal example. I'm currently working with a small ambulance service in Ontario, and they've sort of created this program over the last couple of years where staff, after a traumatic call, can just ask to be put off work. Somebody calls them from the office within 24 hours after that, and then they're given 2 to 5 days, their choice, to be off work if they want to be off work, or to come into the office and do office work if that's what they would prefer, just to kind of take time to process the incident. And they have seen like crazy use of the proper use of the system, but really good amounts of use of the system, and like reductions in their sick time off and things like that. So if we can just provide people with the compassion and the opportunity to process what they've been through, that's how you build trust, right? And that's how we can reduce the stigma and all of the things that surround it.
Thanks very much, Robin. That's great. Like transparency a bit from the organizations and from the members, and then that will help build the trust. We did have a little bit of information come back through on the chat about the warm line, and how that is funded by the government, but is offered by a nonprofit. I didn't know, Rose, did you have any additional comments after seeing that?
Oh, I sent a comment because I just wanted to say this was not about Newfoundland and the warm line. This is an overarching problem. If people interpret things as by the government, I realized how I responded to it because I said Newfoundland, it could be misinterpreted, and I felt really poorly about that. So I just wanted to clarify, this is a reality across organizations whenever you have government contracts involved, and even being run by a nonprofit. What might help, what might help is actually letting people know that it is run by a nonprofit and not the government is probably the key to helping that move forward. So I was really worried about being misinterpreted. It was not intentional to speak to the warm line. The warm line's a great initiative here in Newfoundland. It's like people won't use things because they don't have trust in their employers, and we need to fix that.
Thanks so much, Rose. Okay, so let's see what else we have here in the comments. There's a comment here. Maybe everyone can speak to this. It's about the definition of stigma and how this might help address some of the issues. So I think we need to adopt a robust, inclusive definition of stigma. This includes negative labeling, isolation, and exclusion. We also need to improve knowledge in our anti-stigma campaigns, not just simply awareness. So that kind of goes back to what I was saying. Doing nothing is not the same as being anti-stigmatic or anti-stigma. So does anyone have any thoughts to build on that? Don't make me volunteer you.
I would put Mike forward.
Okay, Mike, you've been tagged.
Terrible, Rose. Yes, in terms of unified definitions, I would agree that when I look at the language we're using in all of these areas, it continues to evolve, and that continues to present barriers in itself to a degree. If we can't agree on a common definition, if we can't agree on common measures, then it becomes difficult to lead the way forward. So yes, I don't know that necessarily I would purport to be an expert on definitions of the concept. I typically look to my academic partners like Rose and Robin in terms of the agreed upon definitions, and then for us organizationally, that helps lead the way forward. And that's, I guess I will say, where we look to CIPSR, arguably, for kind of that validation and across PSP, what is naturally agreed upon and what is the correct direction that we should all be moving in.
Great, thank you. We have a few questions coming through about different treatments. So I've seen a few about, so one is, what are your thoughts on prognosis based on clinical outcomes, not RCT outcomes? So in my experience, PSP with moderate severe PTSD do not improve significantly adhering to evidence-based protocols. So 12 sessions for CPT and 16 sessions for PE. Even with a number of sessions tripled, there is not significant improvement in the severity range. Then there was also a similar question about CISM. So maybe we can touch kind of sort of on treatments, clinical treatments for PTSI, and how stigma can affect the adherence or maybe even completion of the programs. So maybe that's either Robin in the clinical field or Rose.
Yeah, well, I think, like I said before, right, when you have this kind of internalized stigma towards yourself with respect to mental health illness, it's difficult to stick treatment out, or even just to present for treatment, but for sure to stick it out. With respect to clinical versus RCT outcomes, it's kind of a hard thing to speak to. Academics like our evidence base. So I can say I've seen these treatments work. I've treated clients as a student, and I've seen these things work. But there's always there's a number of different things that contribute to the success of treatment. Therapist-client relationships, super important. One thing I always like to remind people, you should shop for a psychologist. Don't just go with the first one. You don't go into a store and put the first shirt on and be like, this is the shirt I'm going to wear. You have to shop around. And I think people think, well, if I go to a psychologist and it doesn't work with them, then it's like therapy is just not going to work for me. But that's not the case. Sometimes the relationship between the two people has to be right for it to work. There's also like deeply ingrained things that we do that we don't recognize that we're doing. So avoidance behavior is one of them. Not avoiding trauma triggers is very important for treatment outcomes. And so if we don't even know that we're avoiding it, it's hard. So there's a lot of different things that contribute to the success of treatment. But stigma is one of the kind of, I think, like the beginnings almost, because if you're feeling so hard against yourself that you have a mental health condition that you don't even start treatment, that's kind of where it starts. But yeah, there's a lot of different things. So I think it's hard, and sometimes it can take a long time to really work through the compounded impact that public safety experiences with PPT.
Thanks, Robin. So in the chat, I'm getting questions that are either related to targeting the organizations or the culture within the PSP sectors to reduce stigma, or looking directly at the PSP individuals as they are. So this kind of speaks to what Robin was saying, about the sensitivity, or like you're not able for the job. So is there any research about that, about how highly sensitive people and PTSI may be interacting or associated, and then how stigma might play a role in that? I'm trying to find the question specifically, but my mouse is striking. But go ahead, Robin. Or Rose, sorry.
Yeah, Rose, go ahead. This isn't an area that I've spent a lot of time looking at, so.
No, I was actually going to say, how do we define and operationalize highly sensitive people? I find that really difficult because that can come in a lot of different ways. So it's really hard for me to answer that.
Yeah, I agree. I find just from some of the personality research that we've done with CIPSERT, with the PSP, it's not as simple as one characteristic is associated with PTSI. It's the combination of characteristics that might make a person more vulnerable, put them at risk, or provide a greater resilience to protect them from PTSI. So that's a good point, Rose. Maybe we'll move on from that comment. So let's see, there was a good one here. Okay, so to build off of Rose's comments on stigma and your coworker overlooking you and belittling your abilities because of your PTSI. So this person is in law enforcement and have been off work due to PTSI. It has always been a goal to return to work in a capacity that is sustainable for me. I have my own internal stigma, thinking that I will be blacklisted or overlooked upon returning. Do you have any suggestions for workers who want to open these conversations and establish that? Just because it's a bit long. Just because we have an injury does not make us less than capable. In my mind, it makes me more capable, and I'm aware of my limitations or triggers, and that self-care is required.
This is the age-long discussion. When you join a public safety career in many spaces, you do psychological screening, and that determines if you can enter. And who's to say, like, if you screen positive for something, why is that a bad thing? You came and overcame something. You have coping skills. It's not, let's choose your own adventure and see what happens once you get exposed in the job. It's, you have the skills and the needs to move forward. But that's stigma. And if we can think about things differently and understand who people are, what they're about, and how to help them, like it's end of the day, it's kindness. Someone's struggling. Don't be like, oh, you're struggling. It's like, hey, how can I help? Right. And we don't know anyone's history, and we don't know all those other things. So I think I think we can all, like, with coworkers and with that fear of going back, it's very real. And that's where I'm kind of playing with this idea. And it's just an idea. It's just playing in my head the last few days. You know, what if people didn't have to leave work altogether? What if they go in reduced hours and modified duties and still contribute? And because it's hard to leave and then come back and face. So maybe we can think about some of the dynamics of those experience in a wholesome way, in like a full mental, physical, social health kind of way, and try to find ways forward that allow people to stay within a space they may care to stay in, leave if they need to leave, but to eliminate part of the challenge of return. So I think there's a lot we can do, but we need to get creative because what we're doing isn't working. So we got to start thinking outside the box. I don't know what the box is. It could be a hexagon, it could be anything, but we just have to figure it out.
Yeah, I totally agree, Rose. Like for me, when I went back to work after I had treatment, I just talked about it. I was like, hey, I had PTSD and now I feel better because I went for therapy. Maybe you should go to therapy. Maybe you would feel better if you went to therapy. So, you know, going back to work, like, my personality is very, outspoken. I've never been one to keep my mouth shut. So, you know, it might be more difficult for somebody who doesn't have that sort of blazon disregard for social norms to speak out like that. But I think what you'll find is that there are a lot of other coworkers out there who are experiencing the same things, and that even though it's really scary to start that conversation at first, I think what you'll find is warmth and acceptance and you know, somebody to talk to about that kind of stuff if you just give it a shot.
That's very good. I'm gonna flip it over maybe to a different approach because we're talking about Rose and Robin. You both talked about people who are experiencing PTSI and talking about it with their coworkers to help break the stigma. But what if we have people? What would you say to someone who wants to reduce their stigmatizing behaviors towards other? Maybe they're aware that they're not necessarily the most supportive, or they're just being insightful. They understand that the culture is there. So what can we do to help people break stigmatizing behaviors towards others? Michael, it looks like you're ready to talk about that.
I'll jump in. So again, less perhaps from an academic perspective and more like getting down to the dirty parts of our organization, a candid answer, if you will. To me, in terms of confronting this behavior, we see people exhibiting stigmatizing behaviors, and how do we deal with that? To me, it builds on what Robin's saying, the open, honest dialogue. But at least for us in CSC, and I assume our other partners in PSP, I've not worked in other areas, but there's this concept of being solid, that you're a dependable person. When if you're in fire services, when the building's on fire, you're running towards it. For Robin as a paramedic, there's an accident, you're moving towards that risk for human life rather than moving back. For us in corrections, there's the fight down range, you're going in the opposite direction of everybody else, right? We pride ourselves on what we can do to keep people safe, the public, our colleagues, our friends, our peers. We put a lot of value and self-worth into what do we do when things are going bad and physical safety is at risk. So taking that into consideration, then, when we look to the numbers, and every once in a while I can look to the numbers, not quite as good as Robin or Rose, but when we look to our insurance numbers, we know that 2/3 of all insurable work injuries relate to people being diagnosed with things like PTSIs. So if that's most likely where we're going to be injured in the course of our duties, why then would we put up barriers? If we're going to be solid, if we're going to be that individual that's there for our colleagues, well, they're most likely to be injured in a mental health capacity. That's not my opinion. That's what our workers' compensation boards tell us. And really, when you look at some self-reflection and what you bring to the table, all of our actions are continually contributing either towards the creation of or erosion from cultures that provide support for our colleagues. So are you part of the problem or are you part of the solution? Because we might be 1 out of 20,000 here at CSC, but you're an important one if you're speaking to supports and encouraging people to step up, or conversely putting up barriers where they feel uncomfortable or that it's not okay to say that they're struggling. So again, it comes down to, it's not just when we're putting up these barriers, yes, we affect the people that are struggling, but we're also affecting our work environments as a whole and creating higher levels of stress for everybody when we allow these stigmatizing behaviors to persist. So again, what I would say to these individuals is, how do you view yourself? Do you view yourself as solid, if that's the term you want to apply? Do you view yourself as a leader? Somebody that can affect positive change in your workplace and create environments that are inherently difficult, but don't need to be made more difficult by ourselves contributing to these negative cultures. So to me, I would put that question back to the individual and say, what do you want your legacy to be in public safety?
Anything to add, Rose or Robin? This will be the last question.
I just want to say that's such a great point, Mike.
Okay, so any closing comments from any of the panelists? I hate to wrap this up. This is a really important discussion, but we are close to, or we are over time here. Nothing else.
I was just going to say thanks for having us. It's a great panel to be on. Thanks to you, Katie, and the panelists. It's lovely, and everyone who's here.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah,
Yep.
thanks, Katie. Very well done.
Thank you
Appreciate
so
it.
much, guys. Thank you all for being here. And I also want to thank Kara Vincent and our KT team at CIPSRT for organizing the panel. And I would like to thank the audience for joining us today and engaging in this most important discussion and providing your insights and questions. Obviously, this is a clearly crucial discussion towards bettering the health of our PSP. And we hope through such conversations we can contribute to destigmatizing PTSI and shifting barriers that impede help-seeking behaviors. So thank you so much, everyone, and have a good rest of the day. Bye now.